The Cincinnati Scenic Railway. CSR is well known for their operations of the Lebanon Mason and Monroe Railroad in Lebanon, Ohio, and the Ohio Rail Experience running across western Ohio. Back in late August of 2020, CSR started the Save the Chessy campaign. This campaign was started to save ex-Chessy system / Baltimore and Ohio 6955 and EMD GP30 from getting scrapped. Stage 1 of the campaign was to raise $35,000 by October 31st, 2020 in order to purchase 6955 from its owner, National Railway Equipment, and luckily they were able to reach their goal before the deadline and secure the purchase of 6955 from NRE. Now, Stage 2 has begun. The second stage of the campaign is to raise $20,000 to help with the move of 6955. The engine is located at NRE's Silvis, Illinois facility in Silvis, Illinois, and CSR wants to move the engine to their facility in Lebanon, Ohio, just north of Cincinnati, Ohio, for restoration. Unfortunately, 6955 has a failed turbocharger and can't run under its own power as of now. But CSR is capable of fixing that and will be able to restore the locomotive back into operational condition. As of now, CSR has a Charity.GoFundMe set up to raise the $20,000 for the move, and it's currently at $3,200 as of the making of this video. So, if you wish to help 6955 on its road to restoration, please go to the Charity.GoFundMe and donate there. You can donate as little as $10 or as much as $500 or more to the campaign, whatever you feel is necessary. Once the goal is reached, 6955 will be moved to Lebanon, Ohio, and restored back to its Chessy system glory. So, if you wish to help, the link to the Charity.GoFundMe will be down in the description box down below, so you can go check that out. CSR also has a Save the Chessy website and Facebook page set up as well. There, you can be notified about any updates or on what's going on with the campaign there as well. Links to the website and the Facebook page will be also linked down below as well, so you guys can go check that out. Hopefully, once the campaign is finished, we'll be able to see the Chessy Cat return to the main line once again. The date is August 10th, 2020. On this day, my brother and I were out visiting Newark, Ohio, to check out the college my brother was going to be attending later that fall. Once we were done at the college, we then swung into town to check out the Ohio Central Railroad. The first place we went to was to the old Pennsylvania Railroad station along East Walnut Street. The station was built in 1888 by the Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis Railroad, which was later acquired by the Pennsylvania Railroad to serve the city of Newark, Ohio. Interestingly, the station was built directly south of the Licking County Courthouse. Back in its heyday, the station saw many notable passenger trains from the Pennsylvania Railroad, such as the Cincinnati Limited, the Spirit of St. Louis, the Union, and a few others. Although the train station did lose its passenger service in 1971 when Amtrak took over passenger services, Amtrak's National Limited did continue to pass by the station, either heading west to Columbus, Ohio, and ultimately St. Louis and Kansas City, or heading east to Denison and ultimately Pittsburgh, Washington, D.C., and New York City. Sadly, the National Limited was discontinued in 1979, and besides some excursion trains, this station has not seen any passenger train service ever since. But the train station still sees trains of today's Ohio Central. As we were looking around at the train station, we then saw some cars moving around the yard just behind the beautiful station. Shunting a train in the yard today was Ohio Central 3306 and 722, two classic EMD SD40-2s. They were in the process of making up their train, which we later found out was bound for Coshocton, Ohio. We then walked across South 2nd Street, where we got a better view of the two SD40-2s at work. As the two SD40-2s were shunting, we then relocated to the junction just east of the old Pennsylvania Railroad station. Besides the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad also served Newark and had their own train station located right here at the junction. The station was built in 1878 and sadly was demolished in 1989. As the two SD40-2s continued to work the yard, let's talk a little bit about their history. 3306 was built in 1972 for the Canadian Pacific Railroad as their 5591. It stayed on the CP until 2006, when it was then sold off to the Evansville Western Railroad, a subsidiary railroad of the Paducah and Louisville Railroad, and renumbered to 6001. It stayed there until 2010, when it was then sold off again to the Ohio Central Railroad, and given its current number and paint scheme. For 722, it was built in 1980 for the Union Pacific Railroad as 3756. 3756 worked for the Union Pacific Railroad all the way till 2006, when it was then sold off to Progress Rail. Once on Progress Rail, it was then leased to the Florida East Coast Railway. They would then later acquire 3756 in late 2007 and renumbered the engine to 722. 722 then stayed on the FEC until mid-2008, when it was then leased to the New England Central Railroad. It was then later sold to them in 2011. It stayed there until 2013, when it was then sold off one more time to the Ohio Central Railroad, where it has stayed ever since. As we watched the Coshocton train get itself together, we then heard the rumble of yet another set of locomotives coming towards the junction. Now this is a treat. Leading this set of locomotives was Ohio Central 4027, a classic EMD SD40T-2, a tunnel motor. It was built in 1980 for the Southern Pacific Railroad as their 8277. 8277 arrived here on the railroad in 2005 and has been here ever since. The Ohio Central used to own 3 of these tunnel motors and had them numbered 4025, 4026, and 4027. Unfortunately, when the Genesee and Wyoming Railroad took over the Ohio Central in 2008, 4025 and 4026 were then moved to the other railroads owned by the G&W, leaving 4027 as the sole SD40T-2 left on the Ohio Central. Behind 4027 was Ohio Central 3329 and 3322, 2 more SD40-2s. As you just saw, 3329 was originally a Union Pacific locomotive being built in 1976 as 8059. In 2000, 8059 was renumbered to 3329 and later in 2011 was sold to the Ohio Central Railroad. When it arrived here on the Ohio Central, the Union Pacific markings were painted over, but thanks to weathering and time, the old UP lettering has shown through the old paint. After I was done admiring 4027, we then moved to the East Main Street / North Morris Street Railroad crossing, where we found 3306 and 722 shunting the train at the crossing. Near the railroad crossing was an Ohio Central signal bungalow. According to the OC, this is milepost 157.34. This milepost is recording the distance between here and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, as this line used to be the Pennsylvania Railroad's Panhandle main line to St. Louis, Missouri. Sadly, OC's ownership of the Panhandle line ends in Mingo Junction, Ohio, 111 miles east of here. Ownership east of Mingo Junction switches over to Norfolk Southern for about 6 miles, where it ends just south of Weirton, West Virginia. The rest of the Panhandle line east of there to Pittsburgh is now abandoned today. The only other large section of Panhandle main line that is left in operation is the line between Terre Haute, Indiana and East St. Louis, Illinois, and that line is operated by CSX Transportations today. As we were waiting to see what this train would do next, we decided to go back to the junction to see if anything else was happening in the yard. But by the time we got back here, 3306 and 722 had started their journey to Coshocton, Ohio, so we gave them pursuit and caught them at their first stop. We are now at the small community of Black Run, Ohio, at the Black Run Road/Road 586 railroad crossing. Here, the train will come to a stop to pick up loaded tanker cars from the National Gas and Oil Corporation. First, the train came to a stop next to the loaded tanker cars to drop off the conductor, and we got to watch as he took off the derail boot on the siding. A derail boot is that little yellow thing on the rails, and it's designed to keep things from either entering into a siding by derailing it, or keep things from leaving the siding by again derailing it. Once the derail boot was off the tracks, the engineer then proceeded to pull the train forward. The conductor will stay here to throw the switches and to help couple and decouple the train as needed. They were pulling the train up to where their empty tank cars they had on board the train were lined up next to the loaded tanker cars that were on the siding. Once the tanker cars were side by side, the conductor then uncoupled the empty tank cars from the rest of the train, and then the engineer pulled the train forward not only past the switch, but also past the railroad crossing, to let the rest of the road traffic get across the crossing. As you just saw, the conductor has just thrown the switch, and now the engineer will back his train onto the siding to pick up the loaded tanker cars. Once they had the loaded tanker cars coupled up to the train, the engineer then pulled the loaded tanker cars out of the siding. In case you're wondering why there's a tree growing inside that strange hopper car, that is because it is a buffer car. A buffer car is usually a car designated to separate highly dangerous goods from the rest of the train. Most of the time on the Class 1 railroads, it's usually a random grain car that serves this purpose. But for the Ohio Central, this car serves that purpose. It's been in this line of duty for so long that a tree has started growing inside it for the little while it's been here. The cargo they were picking up from here was non-odorized liquefied petroleum gas, which is why they were going so slow. Despite the editing here, this whole process of pulling these tanker cars out and adding them to their train took almost an hour. But when dealing with highly dangerous goods, you must be careful. As soon as the loaded tanker cars were out of the siding, they then proceeded to put the empty tanker cars into the siding so they could be loaded up later. As soon as the conductor made the proper connections between the two trains, they then pulled the entire train past the siding. The conductor has stopped the train to take off the Fred at the rear of the empty tank cars. The Fred was that green little box that was sitting on the coupling as the train went rolling by the camera. As soon as the empties are in the siding, the Fred will be placed on the rear of the loaded tank cars, as that will be the rear end of the train. The reason why the conductor has climbed up onto the tank cars is because he will be riding the rear end of the train all the way down to the end of the siding, to make sure that nothing goes wrong during the train's movement. He'll also make sure to set the brakes on the rear end of the tank car to make sure that the cars don't go rolling off when they're done shunting them. After about 20 minutes of waiting, here came the conductor, walking alongside the train cars. He was making sure that nothing was wrong with any of the cars on the train. He soon uncoupled the empty cars from the loaded ones, and then the engineer then pulled the train forward off the empty tank cars. Once the conductor was at the switch, he set the switch to the main line one more time so the engineer could back the train down towards him so he can hop on the front of the train. While they were doing that, we then decided to drive up to the next crossing to try to get a run-by shot of the train, because we thought they were done here. Unfortunately, for some reason, the train ended up staying here for a little while longer. Eventually, we were forced to give up the chase and head home. Luckily, we had better luck 3 days later. The date is now August 13th, 2020. We found ourselves back at the Main Street / Moore Street railroad crossing, where we found our Coshocton train waiting again to leave the yard. Soon, a crew van drove up, and the crew of this train hopped on board and began their journey down the line. Again, leading this train was Ohio Central 3306, but behind it was Ohio Central 3324 and Ohio Central 4029, two more SD40-2s. For OC 3024, it was built in 1979 for the Union Pacific Railroad as 3537. For Ohio Central 4029, it was built in 1978 for the Canadian Pacific Railroad as 5855. When it came to the Ohio Central Railroad, it retained its number until the late 2000s, when it was given its current number. After seeing the train depart here, we then hopped on Highway 16 and caught the train at speed at the Long Drive Railroad crossing just east of the small community of Old Hanover, Ohio. Coshocton train here, we then started our journey back home, but as we were driving along Highway 16, we then saw another train on a different line that followed alongside Highway 16. So we turned around and caught that train at the Pleasant Valley Road/Road 408 railroad crossing east of Tobasso, Ohio. Now there was our second treat. Leading this train hammerhead style was Ohio Central 4099, a rebuilt GE B23-7R, a Super 7. Following close behind in the middle of the train was Ohio Central 3339, another SD40-2. was built in 1972, originally as a U-23B U-boat for the Western Pacific Railroad as their 2265. In 1990, 2265 was rebuilt as a B-23-7R by General Electric and sold to the Monongahela Railway as their 2310. Eventually, 2310 was sold to Conrail and renumbered as 2040. When the Conrail split-up occurred, 2040 was sold to Norfolk Southern and given its current number 4099. It stayed on Norfolk Southern, wearing its old Conrail colors until 2005, when it was sold off to the Ohio Central Railroad, where it has stayed to this day. Ohio Central owns 9 B-23-7Rs with a similar history. The line this train is rolling on is the old Baltimore and Ohio, Wheeling to Columbus main line. This line starts from the junction back in Newark, Ohio, and follows closely to the old Panhandle main line until it turns southeast towards Zanesville, Ohio, where this train is going. Past Zanesville, the old line continues east until it reaches Cambridge, Ohio. The rest of the line east of Cambridge to Wheeling is now abandoned. After the Zanesville train got past us here, we then went home calling it a day. The next day, on the 14th, I had heard from my friend Jake that another one of Canadian Pacific's Heritage Units 7011 was in town leading an ethanol train on CSX. So my brother and I got out to try and see it. We eventually found ourselves at the Aurora Road Bridge, crossing over the CSX Northern Sub in Norfolk Southern's Columbus District. We were joined here by a few other people, which included Jake, and after a short minute of waiting, we then heard the rumble of the CP-led train coming up to the bridge. Although this shot turned out great, I probably won't be doing this shot again for the near future. Aurora Road is what I consider to be a busy road, with truck traffic using the bridge to get to and from the warehouses on the east side of the bridge. Also, parking here is not great either, as you have to walk a considerable distance between your car and this spot. Dang, I missed the old abandoned Locomotive Road Bridge. At least there you didn't have to worry about traffic. Anyway, after the Canadian Pacific-led train got by us, we then went home because we had other things to do that day. 3 days later, my brother and I found ourselves yet again on the old B&O line east of Newark, Ohio. We are at the Stratton's Bridge Road railroad crossing, where we found Ohio Central 4096, yet another B-23-7R leading the Zanesville train in its classic Conrail blue. Following close behind, 4096 and 4099, was again Ohio Central 3339. Similar to 4099, 4096 was built in 1972 as a GE U-23B as Western Pacific 2264. In 1989, when it was rebuilt as a B-23-7R, it went to work for the Monongahela Railway as their 2305. It stayed there, wearing the gray and white striped paint scheme until it was sold to Conrail in the mid-90s and given its Conrail blue paint scheme and renumbered to 2035. After the Conrail split, 2035 was sold to Norfolk Southern and renumbered to 4096, and eventually, in 2005, ended up on the Ohio Central with the others. After seeing the train here, we then moved to the small town of Toboso, Ohio, at the Grady 8 Road Railroad crossing, where we saw 4096, 4099, and 3339 again at the crossing. Just before the train got to the crossing, a motorcyclist pulled up to the crossing, and despite the noise, the shot still turned out great. Got by us, we then went and explored the Black Hands Gorge State Natural Preserve just west of Toboso, Ohio. We got ourselves parked at the Black Hands Gorge North parking lot and hiked down the trail into the gorge. Here, the Leaking River makes a small gorge through some hills, which was named the Black Hands Narrows. The old Baltimore and Ohio Railroad used the Narrows to get from Toboso, Ohio to Newark, Ohio. We were in here to check out this bridge that carried the old B&O Railroad across the Leaking River inside the gorge. After our exploration into the park, we then went back to our car and went home for the day. But before I end the video, there is one more train I wish to show you guys. We'll now turn back the clock to August 9th, 2020. On this day, my brother and I we're at the Ohio Railway Museum, where I caught BC Rail 4622 on a southbound coal train on the Sandusky District. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. My brother and I had a fantastic time exploring the Ohio Central in Newark, Ohio, and we'll definitely be back there shortly to see some more of the Ohio Central. Well, in the meantime, I hope you guys have a great day. See you later.